You think you own this seat? Emily sneered, her voice dripping with confidence. She slid into the chair across from Marcus Thompson, the black CEO of one of the largest airlines in the country. The room went quiet. All eyes shifted to her, as if she had just crossed a line that everyone else feared to even touch. Emily smirked, basking in the attention. Marcus, however, didn't react. He simply glanced at her, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room thickened, the sounds of clinking glasses and low chatter fading into the background. It was as if time itself had paused for a split second. The power dynamics had shifted, and everyone knew it. But Marcus didn't move. He didn't need to. He had learned long ago that true power wasn't about making noise. It was about being in control without lifting a finger. I own this airline, he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. The words hit Emily like a wave crashing over her, drowning her confidence in an instant. Her smile faltered. For the first time, she was speechless. The room held its breath, waiting for her to respond. But there was nothing. The energy had changed. The woman who had walked in like she owned the place was now trapped in her own silence. Everyone knew it was over. The game had ended. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make a scene. He had already won. And all it took was 4 simple words. I own this airline. The weight of those words settled in the room like a storm cloud, leaving Emily frozen in place, unable to speak or even breathe properly. What happened next wasn't just a shift in power. It was a moment of realization. In that instant, the roles had reversed. Emily had gone from being the confident, entitled figure to the one who was humbled, speechless, and unsure of her place. But Marcus remained steady, calm, and undeniably powerful. It wasn't just about owning an airline. It was about owning the moment, owning the respect of everyone in that room, and knowing exactly when to speak and when to let silence do all the work. Emily's mistake wasn't just trying to take a seat that wasn't hers. It was underestimating who Marcus was and the silent authority he held. The lesson was clear. True power never needs to be declared. It simply is. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog, and for the first time, Emily felt the weight of her actions. She had always been the one who commanded attention, the one who made the rules, the one who could walk into any room and claim it as her own. But now, as she sat across from Marcus Thompson, the reality was sinking in. She had underestimated him. She had miscalculated. What she had thought was a simple power move, a harmless act of claiming dominance, had just backfired in front of a room full of people who were now watching her every move. She tried to recover, tried to find some witty response, some clever comeback that could restore the balance. But nothing came. The words that Marcus had spoken, so calmly and without effort, were now echoing in her mind, over and over again. I own this airline. Emily shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of the heat rising in her cheeks. She had thought she was the one in control. She had thought her position, her reputation, her status would protect her from any consequences. But Marcus wasn't intimidated by her. He didn't need to be. He was the one with the power, the one with the experience, the one who had built something from nothing and didn't need to flaunt it to make others feel small. As the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, Emily realized something. She wasn't just sitting at a table. She was being judged, silently but powerfully, by someone who knew exactly how to command respect without raising his voice. The room was watching her, waiting for her to respond, but all she could do was stare at the man across from her. He was calm, collected, and unbothered. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled her. Marcus took a slow sip from his glass, never breaking eye contact with Emily. His expression was unreadable, but there was a certain confidence in the way he carried himself. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He was here because he belonged, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. Emily, on the other hand, was starting to feel small. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the center of attention. She wasn't the one everyone was looking at with admiration or envy. No, now she was just a woman in a chair, frozen by the realization that her actions had consequences. The room was still, the air heavy with unspoken tension. And as Marcus sat there, effortlessly holding the space, Emily could do nothing but sit and stew in the quiet humiliation of her own making. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about power, respect, and knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Emily had learned the hard way that sometimes silence speaks louder than any words could ever do. The air between them felt thick now, every second stretching like a drawn-out breath. Emily was still frozen, but there was something else now, a sense of discomfort she couldn't shake. Her mind raced, searching for a way out of this silent trap, but the more she thought, the less certain she became of her next move. She had expected to intimidate him, to make him feel small in her presence, but it was the exact opposite that had happened. It was as if Marcus had flipped the script entirely, not with grand gestures or loud proclamations, but with quiet confidence. Emily's fingers twitched, her eyes shifting uncomfortably between the people around her, all of whom were subtly watching her, waiting for her to regain control. But they didn't know. They couldn't know what it felt like to be in her shoes right now. She had always been the one in charge, the one people turned to for answers, the one who made the decisions. But here, with Marcus, it was different. She wasn't sure where to look, or what to say, or how to even begin picking up the pieces of her ego that had just shattered. Marcus didn't rush her. He didn't need to. Instead, he let the silence sit between them, allowing it to do all the work. His calm presence was like an anchor, grounding the entire room, and Emily felt herself becoming more and more adrift. He didn't care that she had stolen his seat. He didn't care that she had tried to assert her dominance. He only cared about one thing, the truth of who he was and the truth of who she was. And that truth was becoming painfully clear. Finally, Marcus broke the silence, but it wasn't with anger or frustration. It was with a simple statement that, in its simplicity, felt like the most profound thing he could have said. "You can't take a seat that isn't yours," he said, his voice low but steady. There was no sarcasm, no judgment, just truth. Emily blinked, her mouth slightly agape. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond to someone who could speak so plainly, without any need for theatrics or drama. He wasn't trying to humiliate her. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He had already proven it by not reacting, by simply being. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. She had wanted to challenge him, but now she found herself questioning everything. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers, and for a brief moment, Emily saw something she hadn't expected. It was respect. He wasn't angry. He wasn't annoyed. He was, in his own way, offering her the chance to learn, to step back, reflect, and understand that power wasn't about force, it was about understanding. And in that moment, Emily realized that the seat she had tried to take was never hers to claim. It wasn't about the chair, or the power, or the control. It was about something deeper, something that Marcus had always known and had quietly demonstrated. And Emily, for the first time, had learned the hard way. Marcus remained still, his gaze unwavering. Emily was still processing, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She had thought she was the one who commanded attention, but now, she wasn't so sure. The quiet confidence Marcus exuded was something she had never encountered before. She had always relied on her charm, her quick wit, and her status to control situations. But here, with him, none of that mattered. As the seconds passed, she felt the uncomfortable realization sink deeper. She had tried to stake her claim in a room where the real power had already been established, and it was not hers to take. She was still sitting there, trying to find words, trying to find a way to salvage her pride, but Marcus wasn't giving her the opportunity to. He wasn't rushing to fill the silence. He wasn't making her feel small. He was simply existing in his power, and that was enough. Emily's fingers gripped the armrest, her mind scrambling to come up with something, anything that could make this feel less like a loss. But no matter how hard she tried, the words never came. It was like she was trapped in a fog, and the more she tried to push through it, the more suffocated she felt. Marcus didn't need to play her game. He wasn't trying to win her over or prove anything. He already knew the truth, and that truth had been spoken with those 4 simple words. "I own this airline." There was no argument, no fight. The truth had been stated, and it was unassailable. He didn't need to defend it. It just was. Emily's mind flashed back to all the times she had been the one in control, the one who had the final say, the one who had made everyone else bend to her will. And now, here she was, sitting across from a man who hadn't needed to raise his voice to make her feel like she was nothing. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't as untouchable as she had thought. She wasn't the one everyone had been waiting to impress. Marcus didn't care about her status, her position, or her reputation. He cared about something much deeper, something she hadn't understood until now. Power wasn't about appearance or position. It was about presence. It was about owning the space without having to demand it. And Marcus Thompson, the black CEO who had built his empire from the ground up, had this in spades. Emily took a deep breath, her pride still bruised but slowly giving way to something else, respect. She had thought she was the one who would turn heads, who would command attention. But in that moment, it was Marcus who had done the unthinkable. He had made her see the truth. And that truth was more powerful than any throne she had ever sat on. The tension that had filled the room began to dissipate, but Emily was left with a gnawing feeling in her stomach. She wasn't sure what she had expected to happen next, but it certainly wasn't this. She had walked into the room believing that her reputation, her charm, her authority would speak louder than anything else. Yet, in a matter of moments, Marcus Thompson had shown her that power wasn't about the noise you made. It was about the space you occupied. He had taken control of the room without a single word of condemnation. He didn't need to belittle her or flaunt his success. He had simply been who he was, and in doing so, he had proven that no amount of external bravado could overshadow the quiet strength of true leadership. Emily shifted in her seat again, this time less from nervousness and more from reflection. She could still feel the eyes of the others in the room on her, but now, they seemed distant, almost irrelevant. It was as if they had all witnessed something much bigger than a power struggle between two people. They had seen a lesson in humility unfold, one that Emily had been too stubborn to learn until now. Marcus, still calm and composed, had not spoken again since his simple declaration. He had allowed the silence to settle, knowing that it was in this space of quiet that the most profound realizations took place. Emily's mind began to process what had just happened, but it wasn't until she looked at him, really looked at him, that she started to understand. There was no bitterness in his gaze, no need to prove his worth. He wasn't concerned with her reaction. He was concerned with something far more significant, the truth. And the truth was that the power to influence, to lead, to command, did not lie in titles or positions, but in the quiet confidence that Marcus had displayed effortlessly. For the first time, Emily realized she had been playing a game with rules that only she had set, rules that were based on superficial measures of success, money, status, influence. Marcus had shown her that these were not the true markers of power. True power was about knowing who you were and standing firm in that knowledge, without needing to demand validation from anyone else. Emily had always been the one to dictate the terms, to set the pace. But now, sitting across from Marcus, she understood that the most powerful people were often the ones who made no demands at all. She had been so focused on her own dominance that she had forgotten one simple truth. There was always someone who could humble you, who could show you that your greatest strength lay not in controlling others, but in understanding your own value. As the minutes passed and the silence stretched on, Emily's perspective began to shift. She realized she was no longer the person she had been when she entered the room. The world was no longer revolving around her in the way she had always believed. It was revolving around something far more significant: respect, presence, and understanding. Marcus's calm demeanor, his unwavering confidence, had taught her a lesson she would never forget. It wasn't about taking what wasn't yours. It was about knowing that what you had, what you stood for, was enough. As the room slowly returned to its natural rhythm, Emily found herself caught between the weight of the lesson she had just learned and the uncertainty of what to do next. She could feel the eyes of the others around the table, but they were no longer of consequence. It was as if everything had shifted: her confidence, her position, her understanding of the world. Marcus Thompson had done more than simply claim his space. He had shown her that true power wasn't something to be taken or flaunted. It was something inherent, something that could not be shaken by petty moves or superficial gestures. Emily sat there, her hands now resting lightly on the table, her mind racing. She had been so focused on winning, on proving her worth, that she hadn't realized that the game she had been playing was one of her own design. And Marcus, with his quiet strength, had reminded her that there were no winners in a game where the rules were constantly changing. As Marcus leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but purposeful, Emily felt a shift within herself. It wasn't just about the loss of power, it was the loss of the illusion that she could control everything. The realization hit her with a force she hadn't anticipated. Marcus wasn't a threat. He wasn't an obstacle to be overcome. He was simply someone who knew exactly who he was, and that made all the difference. The more Emily reflected, the more she understood that Marcus wasn't the one who needed to prove anything. He had nothing to prove because he had already won the only battle that mattered, the one for self-respect. And in that quiet moment, Emily came to a startling realization. She had been fighting to take control of a situation that had never truly been hers to dominate. The power, the respect, the confidence that she had longed for were never in the chair she had tried to steal or in the title she had so carefully curated. They were within herself all along. Marcus didn't need to tell her that. He didn't need to speak another word. The lesson had already been imparted, not through grand gestures or speeches, but through his presence, his actions, and his unshakable belief in who he was. She could feel a deep sense of humility growing within her. Emily had always prided herself on her ability to command attention, to make people see her the way she wanted to be seen. But now, she saw something else. She saw how fleeting that attention could be, how easily it could slip away if it wasn't grounded in something real. And Marcus, by simply being himself, had shown her the truth. There was no need for arrogance, no need to force others to recognize her worth. True value came from understanding one's own worth and letting that truth speak for itself. Emily didn't know how to react at first, but as the moments passed, she felt a shift inside her. She had been humbled, yes, but she had also been given something far more valuable than dominance. She had been given perspective. She now understood that in the battle for power, it was not about who had the loudest voice or the most flashy display of control. It was about quiet strength, about knowing who you were and standing firm in that truth. And that was something Marcus had shown her, without ever needing to say a word. As the minutes ticked by, Emily felt herself caught in an unfamiliar stillness. The usual buzz of self-assuredness that had once filled her was absent, replaced by something quieter, something far more profound. She had entered this room with a plan, to take control, to assert her power, and to make her mark. But Marcus had shown her, without raising a finger, that true strength wasn't about dominating a space. It was about owning it with grace. She glanced around the room, still feeling the weight of the stares from the others. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't the kind of tension she was used to. It wasn't about the hustle for dominance or the fight to be seen. It was about respect. And in that moment, Emily realized that the respect she had always longed for wasn't something she could demand. It wasn't something that could be forced or coerced. It was something that had to be earned, quietly and steadily, just like Marcus had done. He wasn't the loudest in the room, nor the most flamboyant. But there was no mistaking the way he commanded respect. It wasn't through arrogance or force, it was through presence. He had nothing to prove. He simply was. And that, Emily thought, was the most powerful thing of all. She had spent so much of her life fighting for attention, for validation, for acknowledgement. But Marcus had just shown her that true power came from within. It wasn't about what others saw or how they perceived you. It was about how you saw yourself. And Marcus saw himself as someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. It was a lesson that was hard for Emily to swallow, but it was one that she knew would stay with her long after this moment passed. Marcus had given her something far more valuable than a seat at the table or a win in a game of power. He had given her a new perspective on life and leadership. The more she thought about it, the more she understood. This wasn't just about her. It was about how we all move through the world. Power wasn't in what you took, it was in what you gave. Marcus had given her the gift of understanding, the kind of understanding that only comes when you stop trying to control everything and start letting things be. Emily sat up straighter in her chair, the realization dawning on her like the first rays of sunlight breaking through the dark. She wasn't the same person she had been when she walked into this room. She wasn't the woman who thought power was about having the loudest voice or the most impressive title. She was someone different now, someone who understood that true strength came from knowing your own worth and not needing to prove it to anyone. As the conversation around her slowly resumed, Emily found herself no longer desperate to participate. She didn't need to dominate the discussion, and she didn't need to make anyone see her a certain way. She simply needed to be. And that was enough. As the meeting continued, Emily found herself retreating into a quiet space in her mind. Her usual sharpness, The drive to speak up, to dominate the conversation, had diminished. The words being exchanged around her felt distant, like the noise of a crowded street muffled by thick glass. Her focus was no longer on the business at hand or the people around her, but on the shift within herself. She was no longer seeking approval. She no longer cared about impressing anyone. Her thoughts kept returning to Marcus, to the way he had handled the moment with such calm, such quiet authority. She couldn't help but feel a deep respect for him. Not for the airline he owned or the wealth he had accumulated, but for the quiet way in which he carried himself. There was no need for validation. He had nothing to prove to anyone, and that, more than anything, had made him stand out. Emily's mind drifted back to her own life, her career, the countless people she had left in her wake as she fought her way to the top. She had thought that this was what mattered, that the chase for success was the ultimate goal. But now, she wasn't so sure. What if the success she had been chasing wasn't the right kind? What if it had always been about the wrong things? The realization left her unsettled, but in a way that felt freeing. She had spent so much of her life trying to be something she wasn't, trying to fit into a mold that didn't belong to her. Marcus had shown her that real power wasn't in bending others to your will, but in staying true to who you are, no matter the external pressures. She glanced across the room again, her eyes landing on Marcus, who was still the same steady presence he had been earlier. He was engaged in the conversation, but there was no rush, no urgency in his manner. His calmness was contagious, and for the first time, Emily realized she had been moving too fast her entire life. She had been caught in a cycle of trying to outpace everyone else, but now she saw the value in slowing down. There was no need to rush. There was no need to make a spectacle of herself. The lesson Marcus had taught her was clear. Strength didn't lie in being the loudest or most assertive. Strength was about being comfortable with silence, about knowing your worth without needing anyone else to validate it. Emily's shoulders relaxed for the first time in hours. The weight she had been carrying for so long, this need to prove herself, seemed to lift, and she finally understood. She had been looking for power in all the wrong places. But Marcus had shown her that real power came from within. As the meeting wrapped up, Emily stood, no longer with the same urgent need to speak, but with a new sense of clarity. She didn't need to fight for a seat at the table. She already had a place. All she had to do was own it. As Emily walked out of the room, she felt an unfamiliar lightness in her step. It wasn't just that the meeting had ended or that the business was concluded. No, something had shifted deep within her, something she hadn't expected but now couldn't ignore. The pressure she had carried for so long, the relentless need to prove herself, had faded, leaving space for something else. She couldn't quite put it into words yet, but she knew it was the beginning of a new chapter. Her mind kept returning to Marcus. Not because of the way he had shown his authority, not because of his wealth or status, but because of how he had taught her to see the world differently, to see herself differently. She had walked into the room determined to take control, to assert her dominance, and to leave a lasting impression. But in the end, it was Marcus's quiet confidence that had left the most profound impact. There had been no grand speeches, no power struggles. Instead, there had been a simple but powerful truth. Self-assurance was the greatest form of strength, the kind that didn't require anyone else's acknowledgement. It was the kind of strength that came from within, a knowing of who you were and a peace with that. She thought back to the early days of her career, how much she had struggled to be seen, to be heard. She had fought for every inch of recognition, constantly feeling as though she had to prove her worth to those around her. But now, she saw how exhausting that fight had been, how much energy she had wasted on things that didn't truly matter. The need to be acknowledged, the hunger for approval, it had all been a distraction from what really mattered. What really mattered was the ability to stand firm in her own worth, without needing to be constantly validated by others. As Emily made her way through the hallway, she could feel the weight of those realizations settling into her. It was as though the world had opened up in a way that it never had before. She no longer felt the pressure to be anything other than who she was. And for the first time, that felt like enough. She reached the elevator, pressing the button for the lobby, but her mind was still racing. The quiet strength Marcus had shown her had sparked something inside of her, a desire to lead with authenticity, to move through the world with intention and clarity, not force. She didn't need to chase success anymore. She didn't need to prove that she was capable. She already knew that. And now, for the first time, she could truly own it. The elevator doors opened, and Emily stepped inside, her reflection in the glass a reminder of how much she had changed in just one afternoon. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that room. She had learned a valuable lesson. True power comes from within, and it is enough to simply be. As the doors closed, Emily smiled to herself. The weight of the world lifted, knowing that she was finally on her own path. One she had carved, not through domination, but through understanding and acceptance of who she truly was.